In the first half of the 17th century, global trade was undergoing an unprecedented transformation driven by the mighty Dutch East India Company, VOC. This transnational corporation was not merely a commercial enterprise but a state within a state, possessing its own vast fleet, a mercenary army, the power to sign international treaties, mint its own currency, and officially declare war. The company's singular goal was to monopolize the lucrative trade in exotic spices, a pursuit that required constant, perilous navigation across vast oceans filled with storms and uncharted dangers. To achieve maximum speed and efficiency, European navigators began utilizing a new route, the Roaring Forties. This path allowed ships rounding the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa to surge eastward on the power of strong prevailing westerly winds before turning sharply north toward Java. However, this route concealed a massive, hidden danger. Due to the imperfection of instruments for calculating longitude, the slightest error could lead to a catastrophic collision with the uncharted western coast of the Southland, known today as Western Australia. This terrible fate befell the company's flagship and most modern vessel, the Batavia, in June 1629, an event that became one of the darkest and most significant chapters in the early European exploration of the continent. The Batavia, which departed on its maiden voyage from the port of Texel in the Netherlands in late October 1628, was a marvel of shipbuilding of its time. It carried immense, almost unfathomable wealth, 12 chests filled with silver coins for purchasing spices in Asia, exquisite jewelry, valuable antiquities, and over 340 people on board. Among them were not only hardened sailors and mercenary soldiers but also merchants, high-ranking officials, and their wives and children heading to the colonies in search of a new life. Commanding this vital expedition was senior merchant Francisco Pelset, a highly experienced and educated trader who, however, lacked significant military or naval authority among the rough crew. The ship was physically steered by skipper Adrian Jacobs, a man who was extremely harsh, ambitious, and skilled in seamanship. A deep personal animosity quickly developed between these two leaders, exacerbated by the harsh conditions of the long voyage, overcrowding, and disease. This conflict created ideal, fertile ground for conspiracy among dissatisfied sailors. The key figure in a potential mutiny was the under-merchant Jeronimus Cornelisz, a bankrupt apothecary with a dangerously charismatic nature and radical views, who had joined the company fleeing debts and persecution in Europe. Cornelisz and Jacobs began to carefully but purposefully plot a massive mutiny to seize the powerful ship and its countless treasures, intending to start a carefree life of piracy at the edge of the world. But their criminal plans were not destined to unfold as they had carefully calculated. In the early hours of June 4, 1629, as the ship sailed under full canvas through impenetrable darkness, the Batavia struck a sharp coral reef in the treacherous Houtman Abrolhos archipelago, located approximately 60 kilometers from the desolate western coast of modern Australia. The impact was so powerful and sudden that it instantly shattered the lower part of the oak hull, tearing away the rudder. Total panic seized the people who awoke to the terrifying roar of breaking timber and cries for help. In the pitch blackness, amidst giant waves crashing with incredible force against the coral reef, a desperate and chaotic evacuation began. Most passengers and crew members, though with great difficulty, managed to ferry themselves to two small nearby coral islands that barely rose above the turbulent water. However, these tiny patches of land proved to be completely devoid of any natural sources of fresh water or vegetation. They were merely dead fragments of sharp coral and sand protruding from the ocean under the relentless, scorching southern sun. The more than 250 people who miraculously survived the horrific shipwreck suddenly found themselves in a deadly trap at the very edge of the known European world, completely surrounded by a boundless ocean and a harsh, unforgiving nature, without the slightest hope of quick rescue. The situation on the barren islands rapidly became critical and demanded immediate action. Francisco Pelset, clearly realizing that without a stable supply of fresh water they were all inevitably doomed to a painful death from thirst within days, made a fateful decision that still sparks heated debate among historians. Together with the rebellious skipper Jacobs, several senior officers, and the most experienced sailors, he took the only large surviving longboat and set off in search of life-giving water on the uncharted mainland visible on the horizon. Finding no suitable sources on the inhospitable and arid coast of Western Australia, Pelset decided to attempt an unprecedented and desperate feat, to cross the open Indian Ocean and reach the trading port of Batavia to personally bring back a proper rescue ship. This strategic decision meant leaving over 260 confused people to their fate on the tiny Abrolhos Islands for months of uncertainty. Since Jeronimus Cornelisz was the highest-ranking company representative on the islands after Pelset's departure, he automatically became the leader of the survivors. His unexpected, absolute power over this isolated group of frightened, exhausted, and thirsty people became the main catalyst for events that turned the struggle for physical survival into sheer terror. Pelset's departure created a dangerous power vacuum that Cornelisz quickly and ruthlessly filled, masterfully using human fear to establish his own dictatorship. Thus, a common disaster caused by a navigational error demonstrated how thin and fragile the boundaries of human civilization can be in total isolation. While Pelset conquered thousands of nautical miles in one of the greatest open-boat voyages in history, a bloody tragedy was relentlessly unfolding on the Abrolhos Islands. With Commander Pelset gone, the survivors on the Abrolhos Islands were left in a desperate state of limbo. Jeronimus Cornelisz, the charismatic but deeply flawed under-merchant, was now the highest-ranking official of the Dutch East India Company remaining on the reef. Initially, Cornelisz was stranded on the wreck of the Batavia itself, which was slowly breaking apart under the relentless pounding of the Indian Ocean waves. It took several days before he managed to float across to the islands on a makeshift raft. Once ashore, he surveyed a grim scene: hundreds of frightened, thirsty, and starving people clustered on two main coral outcrops, which they had named Batavia's Graveyard and Traitors Island. Instead of organizing a cooperative effort to survive, Cornelisz saw an unprecedented opportunity to realize the dark ambitions he had harbored during the voyage. He realized that if a rescue ship ever did arrive, his previous plotting of a mutiny would likely be exposed by those who remained loyal to the company. To secure his own survival and absolute control, he needed to eliminate anyone who might oppose him or consume the dwindling, precious supplies that had been salvaged from the wreck. Cornelisz was not a man of physical violence himself. Instead, he was a master manipulator, a psychopath who used psychological control and the promise of wealth to bind a group of ruthless young men to his cause. He systematically began to dismantle any potential resistance. First, he confiscated all weapons and the remaining boats, ensuring that no one could challenge his authority or attempt an escape. Then, he cleverly divided the survivors. He sent a group of soldiers, led by the steadfast and honorable Corporal Weeb Hayes, to a distant, larger island, now known as West Wallaby Island, under the pretext of searching for fresh water. Cornelisz secretly believed the island was completely barren and expected the soldiers to die of thirst within days, conveniently removing the greatest military threat to his planned dictatorship. He also dispersed other groups to various smaller islands, severely weakening the collective strength of the survivors. With the loyalists out of the way, Cornelisz established a brutal, dictatorial regime on Batavia's Graveyard. He formed a personal guard of mutineers, bound to him by a twisted oath of loyalty and the promise of a share in the ship's immense treasure, which they continued to fish out from the sunken wreckage. What followed was a 2-month reign of terror that remains unparalleled in Australian maritime history. Cornelisz and his men embarked on a systematic campaign of mass murder, targeting anyone they deemed a burden or a threat. The killings were executed with chilling calculation. The sick, the weak, and the elderly were the first victims, often strangled in their sleep or taken out on small boats and drowned under the guise of being relocated. As the mutineers' bloodlust grew, the murders became more brazen and horrific. Entire families were slaughtered in cold blood, men were hacked to death with swords, and women were either killed or kept as forced concubines for Cornelisz and his inner circle. Cornelisz himself rarely participated in the actual bloodshed, preferring to sit in a specially constructed tent adorned with fine salvaged fabrics and stolen jewels, ordering executions like a deranged monarch. He manipulated his followers into committing these atrocities, convincing them that they were outside the jurisdiction of human laws and that their actions were justified by the harsh necessity of survival. The death toll climbed steadily, with over 100 innocent men, women, and children falling victim to the mutineers' paranoid and sadistic purge. However, Cornelish's master plan contained a fatal flaw. He had severely underestimated the resilience and resourcefulness of Corporal Weeb Hayes and the soldiers he had banished to the High Islands. Contrary to Cornelish's expectations, the soldiers did not perish from thirst. By a stroke of incredible luck, they discovered a natural rock pool filled with fresh rainwater and an abundance of Tamar wallabies and seabirds to sustain them. When survivors fleeing the slaughter on Batavia's Graveyard managed to drift across the water on makeshift rafts, they brought with them the horrifying news of Cornelisz's bloody regime. Realizing the desperate situation, Hayes quickly organized his men. Though they were stripped of their firearms, the soldiers were disciplined and determined. They fashioned crude but effective weapons from timber and iron salvaged from the wreckage that washed ashore, including pikes and morning stars. They built small stone forts, the first European structures ever erected on Australian soil, and prepared to defend themselves against the inevitable assault. The stage was now set for a brutal confrontation on the isolated coral reefs, a desperate struggle for survival not just against the elements, but against the darkest depths of human depravity, waiting for a rescue that might never come. The tension between the two island camps escalated rapidly as Jeronimus Cornelisz realized that the continued survival of Weeb Hayes and his soldiers posed a lethal threat to his newly established kingdom of terror. If a rescue ship were ever to appear on the horizon, Hayes would undoubtedly signal them first and expose the unprecedented mutiny and mass murder. To prevent this, Cornelisz was forced to abandon his passive strategy and take the offensive. He ordered his heavily armed followers to cross the shallow reef channels and assault the soldiers' fortified positions on West Wallaby Island. However, the mutineers, despite possessing muskets, swords, and pikes salvaged from the wrecked Batavia, fundamentally lacked the military discipline and unified purpose of their adversaries. When they launched their initial attacks across the jagged coral, they were met by a highly organized and resolute defense. Hayes's men, fueled by a profound sense of duty and the desperate need to survive, utilized their improvised weapons with devastating effect. The harsh coral terrain favored the defenders, who used the crude stone breastworks they had painstakingly constructed to repel multiple disorganized assaults. The psychological advantage began to shift. The ruthless hunters suddenly found themselves outmatched and outmaneuvered by the very men they had confidently sent away to die. Recognizing that a direct military victory was proving impossible against the entrenched soldiers, Cornelisz resorted to his preferred weapon of choice: deceit. In early September 1629, under the false pretense of negotiating a peaceful truce, Cornelisz approached the soldiers' camp with a small group of his most trusted lieutenants. His true, underlying intention was to systematically bribe Hayes's men with the promise of salvaged company silver and a safe passage home if they agreed to surrender their officers. But Hayes, having already learned the horrifying details of the massacres from escaping survivors who had drifted over on rafts, was not easily fooled by the psychopath's promises. In a sudden and highly coordinated maneuver, the soldiers ambushed the delegation. They managed to capture the dictatorial leader alive, binding him securely, while cutting down several of his key accomplices in the ensuing scuffle. The unexpected loss of Cornelisz sent shockwaves through the remaining mutineers back on Batavia's graveyard. Now operating under the frantic command of a desperate man named Wouter Loos, the surviving rebels knew their time was rapidly running out. They launched one final, massive assault on West Wallaby Island, utilizing their remaining gunpowder and sheer numbers in a frantic, all-or-nothing attempt to break the siege and rescue their captive leader. Just as this final, bloody skirmish was reaching its violent climax, a miraculous and entirely unexpected sight appeared on the western horizon. It was the Sardam, a rescue vessel commanded by Francisco Pelset, who had successfully navigated the treacherous Indian Ocean in a small boat to Java and returned to save his stranded crew. A desperate race immediately ensued. Hayes, acutely realizing the immense danger of the situation, dispatched a small, improvised boat to intercept the Sardam before the heavily armed mutineers could reach it and potentially hijack the rescue ship for their escape. Hayes's men rowed frantically and reached Pelset first, quickly informing the horrified commander of the unimaginable slaughter and treachery that had unfolded during his long absence. When the mutineers' boats arrived shortly after, heavily armed and attempting to feign innocence, Pelset was already prepared. He ordered the ship's cannons heavily trained directly on their small vessels, forcing their immediate and unconditional surrender. The 2-month reign of terror on the Abrolhos Islands was finally brought to an abrupt and decisive end. The consequence of the mutiny was a swift and uncompromising application of 17th-century naval justice. Pelset conducted a thorough, grim investigation amidst the grisly evidence of mass graves scattered across the Coral Islands. Because the Sardam was far too crowded to transport all the prisoners back to Batavia safely for trial, Pelset convened a makeshift, legally binding court on the islands themselves. The ringleaders, prominently including Jeronimus Cornelisz, were intensely interrogated, tortured according to the legal customs of the time, and subsequently hanged on gallows erected on the very sands where they had committed their atrocities. In a notable historical footnote, Pelset chose a completely different punishment for two minor mutineers. He marooned them on the desolate coastline of the Western Australian mainland. These two men, left with a few meagre supplies and instructions to make contact with the local inhabitants, inadvertently became the first recorded European residents of the Australian continent, their ultimate fate forever lost to the vastness of the outback. The Batavia incident remains one of the absolute darkest chapters in maritime history, a chilling testament to how quickly the thin veneer of civilization can shatter under extreme isolation. Yet, it also yielded some of the earliest detailed European records of the Australian environment, leaving a highly complex legacy of blood, survival, and grim discovery on the very edge of the known world.